How are your press corps people reacting now? I mean, I'm reading, and I think I even read it in one of your periodicals that you write, that some are acknowledging Donald Trump is actually accomplishing some things. Well, yeah, lots of things, but they're all leftists. So how are they reacting?
Well, up until recent, 90% of the Trump news has been negative, been pretty consistent since he took office in January, and even before then. And I think I saw correctly a day or two ago that about 3 to 5% of the news about Trump, I think it was right at 5% of the Trump news is positive. So,
That's right.
you know, these
same.
people just can't contain their dislike of this president, but some things are so obvious, Jan, and that's what we're seeing. A few of them, Jake Tapper and a few others, that have just had to acknowledge that that was a good thing, or this policy was a good thing, or that law was a good thing. So, you know, when it's obvious, they have no other choice when it comes from a credibility standpoint to acknowledge that this is a good thing.
To be quite deranged over some of the things that he's promised to do and has accomplished, from reducing the Leviathan state of government and cutting over 80 progressive government bureaucracies and organizations and rules and regulations, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, stimulating the economy, Supreme Court and Appeals Court appointments. ISIS has lost most of its caliphate, so I would hope the left would acknowledge some of that.
Absolutely, Janet. And I added the list of 81 major Trump achievements in my weekly news report last Friday. And there was also 11 Obama legacy items that were repealed. When you look at these, and I just went over this just before the program, and I look at these, I go, I remember a lot of these, but there's a lot of them that I wasn't fully aware of. And it's a very impressive first 11 or so months in office by what he's been able to accomplish. You know, at times we've talked about this. He has a good week, and then he says something at the end of the week that detracts from all the good things that happened that week, and it ends up being a weekend Twitter war. But the bottom line is he's accomplished a lot with some very, very challenging environment to operate within, and you just got to give him a lot of credit.
Well, you said to me that Donald Trump is up against the New World Order, the globalists, and the globalists tend to rule the world. He threw them a curveball. Can they derail him?
I think they would like to, obviously, Jan, but I mean, how do you do it? I mean, he is, you know, when you look at some of the things he brings up and then does, I mean, these are very practical issues when it comes to NATO, 24 or 28 countries that hadn't paid their dues. And, you know, he told them right in Brussels when I was with him on the Trump trip, you know, in May, pay up. You guys need to pay up. And he was able to get $7 or $8 billion of money that had not been paid, that had been committed to. You know, the Paris Accord, I mean, he had a very lengthy meeting on that same trip with the Pope. And one of the things the Pope gave him was his writings on global warming and the seriousness of global warming. And then he went to the G8 meeting, G7, G8 meeting in Italy, and said, you know, he'll consider it, he'll discuss it, and came back and made his own decision. I mean, he is making decisions that a lot of us would do, but when it comes to political figures, they don't very often have the courage to make these decisions. Whether it's confronting North Korea, confronting Iran, dealing with Russia, dealing with NATO, dealing with ISIS, he takes tough stuff on, and I know a lot of people appreciate that.
Well, what about pulling funds out of the United Nations? Did we ever think we'd see that?
No. And that's been necessary for a long time. I remember when they, you know, had to put John Bolton through during a recess, Senate recess. President Bush couldn't get him affirmed, so he had to run him through during a recess. And he was a fantastic ambassador. And John Bolton said, you know, if 4 or 5 of these stories just disappeared at the UN, they'd never know they were gone. And there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of hypocrisy. There's a lot of obsession with the state of Israel, which Nikki Haley has been so effective at communicating from the day that she took office as our ambassador. You know, we provide almost 25% of their annual budget. And I think that the Trump-Haley team have been great at the UN and called them for what they are, hypocrites and anti-Semitic. They're not quite using that word, but the fact that this bias against Israel must be no more. And the fact that, just this recent decision on Jerusalem, willing to say we're going to take notes of who's with us and who's against us and do something about it.
Well, I want to go there, and I'll go there right now because Donald Trump's supporters, they celebrate his boldness and they celebrate his break from Washington as usual. They celebrate his separation from business as usual, and one of the biggest items in 2017, back in December, was his move to make Jerusalem the noted capital of Israel. Now, no major power in the world has done this, and of course, we all know that several presidents have promised to do this, and this is the city with God's name on it, according to 2 Chronicles 12, 2 Chronicles 33. There, God speaks of his ownership of the city, and he's going to return there, and the Jews occupied it long before any Arab did. It goes back 3,000 years as sacred to the Jews, 2,000 years as sacred to the Christian, and Donald Trump came along in December and did something quite incredible. Bill, let me play a quick clip here. It's Dr. Robert Jeffress talking about this, and I think this might set the stage for you and I having a short discussion here.
Well, I have been over the last several days on a conference call with State Department officials and White House officials about this. And look, I believe President Trump is a modern profile in courage for having the guts to do what no other American president has been willing to do. And look, those who are devout Jews and Christians celebrate this decision because they believe what the Bible says, that God gave this country to Israel and made Jerusalem the capital 3,000 years ago. But beyond that, this is the right thing to do. I mean, we recognize the right of every other country in the world to name its own capital. Nobody argues with France's right to make Paris its capital city. Why should Israel be any different? I think the president made the right call here.
Well, he's made a lot of, it's been great for him with his evangelical base, and there's a lot of people that do see it your way. I think there is a lot of concern, and there has been in the past from politicians, that this will stir the pot, and you worry about what this is going to do to, the Middle East at this point, because it's angered a lot of people as well.
Well, I think the president made an excellent point yesterday when he said the current policy that has been in place for decades certainly hasn't made peace in the Middle East. Maybe it's time to try something new. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I think as the White House, the president, Jared Kushner, sit down at the negotiating table, perhaps it's the wise move to go ahead and take Jerusalem off the table to begin with and start negotiating from a position of strength rather than weakness.
A lot of people do think that this is going to derail, as you're talking about, the peace process. And I guess my question to you is, what should we look at and learn from history in regards to this?
Well, I think what we ought to look at is history. Even for those who don't believe the Bible, history confirms that this land belongs to Israel. This idea of Palestinians, most of our viewers don't know that term Palestine was invented by the Roman Emperor Hadrian in 100 AD as a way of saying to the conquered Jewish people, this land is no longer yours. But history shows that Israel, the Jewish people, occupied this land before the Arabs, before the Palestinians, before the Muslims. And I had an Israeli officer say to me one time, he said, Robert, what if Israel said to the United States, we are no longer going to recognize Washington, D.C. as your capital until you divide a portion of the capital and give it to Canada and another portion of Mexico to be neighborly. That is ludicrous, but that illustrates exactly why the president made exactly the right call. He is on the right side of history, and more importantly, he's on the right side of God.
You're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I have on the line from Washington Bill Koenig. You've heard him on my program many times, been a conference speaker a number of times as well. Bill, he was just called a profile in courage and on the right side of God. You and I would agree with that, but boy, it makes some people angry to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, Jan, there were some of us that worked really, really hard behind the scenes on two things. One is having President Trump reconsider his active involvement with the peace process, and also going ahead and moving his embassy to Jerusalem, and also acknowledging the reality of the fact that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. All their government offices, all the key government offices are located in Jerusalem. So let me put it this way. When I wrote a letter on September 6th and delivered to the White House along with my updated eye-to-eye, which is 572 pages of events, catastrophes that took place when we were pressuring Israel to divide their land. And good friend of yours, Michelle Bachmann, and others, we lobbied hard for President Trump to fully understand the biblical significance of this land and that no earthly leader has the right to divide the land. And shortly thereafter, President Trump said that he would not impose, in other words, not pressure the sides to make a decision. And also when it came to two states, that was up to Israel and the Palestinians to determine whether two-state was the proper solution. And he has said this over and over again since then. And so I really thank the Lord for those of us and others that have emphasized the strong evangelical support of the State of Israel and Jerusalem, the importance of the city of Jerusalem, to motivating the President to make this decision at a sooner time. And with all that said, Jan, it hasn't produced a lot of the so-called Arab backlash. It's really been pretty calm. The only ones that have really raised a ruckus have been the Palestinians and then a few of the Arab leaders. Other than that, it's been very calm.